And we gotta know who the manager is gonna be.
Over the years, managers have played crucial roles within the wrestling business, from tripping over baby faces and distracting referees to being mouthpieces for their clients. Managers come in a wide variety of types, ranging from retired wrestlers to non-wrestlers who are perfect heat magnets. In this list, we take a look at our top 8 picks for the greatest managers to ever do it. So pull out your most outrageously bright outfit, tell those refs they need to count faster, and let's dive into this list. Number 8. The Grand Wizard. Starting out in pro wrestling around the Detroit area in the 60s, Ernie Roth would find his way over to the WWF and become known as the Grand Wizard of Wrestling in the 70s. Roth reportedly took the name the Grand Wizard to snub the white supremacy organization the Ku Klux Klan, whose leaders were called Grand Wizards. His outfits were famously flamboyant suits, a pair of crazy shades topped off with a turban that was always decorated with jewels and feathers, giving him a unique and unforgettable look. The Grand Wizard had a fantastic way with words and a great knowledge of the wrestling business that shone through his work. He was involved in a lot of major talents and angles throughout the 70s, managing Mr. Fuji and Tanaka in their 2 reigns as Worldwide Wrestling Federation Tag Team Champions, as well as Stan Stasiak as the WWF Champion, and of course, most famously, superstar Billy Graham. Number 7. Paul Bearer. Entering the wrestling business in the early 70s and wrestling under the name Mr. X before becoming a manager known as Percy Pringle, years before him and The Undertaker would form their famous duo, he managed The Undertaker for WCCW when he was known as Texas Red. Strangely enough, Paul Bearer actually left the wrestling business for a few years in the early 80s to get his degree in mortuary science, earning certification as an embalmer and mortician. In 1990, the Paul Bearer character would be unleashed on the world when Brother Love decided The Undertaker needed more love than he could give and introduced Brother Bearer to the world. Using his urn to help rise The Undertaker from the ground whilst in the ring gave The Undertaker depth and extra character, and shortly after his debut, Paul Bearer got his own WWF talk show segment entitled The Funeral Parlor, which served to build some great feuds for The Undertaker. Number 6. Classy Freddie Blassie. Blassie first broke into wrestling and shoot fighting in the carnival days in the 1930s around St. Louis. After World War II, he traveled around New York wrestling before moving to Los Angeles in the early 50s. Working between Georgia and LA, Blassie became one of the most notorious heels in the history of wrestling, often requiring police escorts to get him to and from the ring safely. He played a crucial role in establishing Japanese pro wrestling in 1962, and he wrestled there until 1968. During this time, Blassie also worked for the WWF, coming in as a challenger for Bruno Sammartino. Blassie arrived in spectacular fashion, brandishing his own world title belt and claiming that he was there to unify the world titles. By the early 70s, Blassie began to wind down his wrestling career and decided to transition into a manager's role, retiring from active competition in 1974. For the rest of his career, he called the WWF his home, being known as one of the 3 wise men of the East alongside Lou Albano and the Grand Wizard. Blassie's most famous managerial pairing was with Hulk Hogan, but he also managed Muhammad Ali when he went up against Tony Inoki. Blassie even publicly represented Ali for media events and interviews for a period in the mid-1970s. One of Blassie's greatest pairings was when he managed the Iron Sheik in his championship victory over Bob Backlund, briefly changing his name to Ayatollah Blassie. Later, he managed Mikhail Volkov when the Sheik and Volkov formed their tag team, leading them to the World Tag Team Championships. In November 1986, Blassie retired from active managing, announcing that he had sold his contracts for the tag team to Slick. He would then make random appearances on WWF programming for many years before his death in 2003. Blassie will always be remembered for his great promos, but he will also be remembered for calling us all pencil neck geeks. Number 5. Gary Hart. Starting his career as a wrestler in 1960, Hart competed in the Chicago and Detroit territories before retiring from in-ring competition and transitioning into the manager role in the late 60s, adopting the name Playboy Gary Hart. He worked on and off in Australia under Jim Barnett until 1974, after which he relocated to Atlanta and became involved in Georgia Championship Wrestling. By 1979, Hart found his home at Big Time Wrestling, where he eventually became the booker and later rebranded it to World Class Championship Wrestling. He is credited with leading the company into its golden years, most notably creating the iconic feud between the Von Erichs and the Fabulous Freebirds. Hart managed a stable called New Age Management, which consisted of monster heels like Nord the Barbarian, Abdullah the Butcher, Al Perez, and Jeeves Swanson. He also made appearances in the Mid-Atlantic area between 1983 and 1988, managing the likes of Bruiser Brody, Kevin Sullivan, and Mark Lewin as a heel manager. In 1989, he managed the stable J-Tex Corporation for Jim Crockett's WCW, which included Terry Funk, Dick Slater, Buzz Sawyer, the Dragon Master, and the Great Muta. Gary Hart continued to sporadically manage in the 90s until around 2004. He even briefly started a promotion with Chris Adams in Texas called Texas Wrestling Federation, as well as the awfully named successor, World Class 2, The Next Generation. He passed away on March 16, 2008, but left behind an incredible body of work in the Texas wrestling history books. Number 4. J.J. Dillon. Most famous as the legendary manager of the Four Horsemen, J.J. Dillon is one of the smartest minds in the history of the wrestling business, and he doesn't get nearly enough credit for it. He first broke into the business as a referee in the 60s before transitioning into becoming a wrestler. Dillon worked his way up within the industry, selling event programs and working as part of the ring crew in exchange for free admission to WWF shows. He even ran the fan club for Johnny Valentine. In the 60s, Dillon wrestled in various territories such as Florida, Georgia, Texas, and the Nova Scotia territory, commonly referred to as the Maritimes. He also had intermittent stints in the WWF between the 60s and the 80s. Eventually, he made the transition into becoming a manager. He first managed the Mongolian Stomper in Dallas before working with Buddy Landau and later becoming the manager for Tully Blanchard. Shortly after this, Dillon began managing the Minnesota Wrecking Crew, which would ultimately lead to the formation of the Four Horsemen. In 1985, during a JCP television segment, the idea for the Four Horsemen came to life when J.J. Dillon, with his clients, cut a heel promo adding Ric Flair to the segment for a little extra heat. Arn Anderson famously referred to them as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and it sounded so cool that Dillon became the manager for the group now known as the Four Horsemen. Throughout his later years, Dillon worked in various roles within the wrestling business, including booking WrestleMania 8 whilst working for the WWF. J.J. Dillon's contributions to the wrestling world, both in and outside of the wrestling ring, have left a lasting impact on the industry. Number 3. Jim Cornette. Jim Cornette, a polarizing personality in the wrestling world, is widely considered a genius by many wrestling fans. He is best known for his managerial role in the National Wrestling Alliance, where he managed the legendary tag team, the Midnight Express, as well as for his booking work in promotions such as OVW, TNA, ROH, the WWF, and his short-lived promotion, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Cornette's journey in wrestling began at the age of 14 when he worked as a photographer, and by 1982 he had caught the attention of promoters around the Memphis territory and he was offered a manager's role. Adopting the name James E. Cornette as a tribute to the promoter James E. Barnett, he debuted as a rich, spoiled child turned into an inept wrestling manager on September 25, 1982. His gimmick often involved him getting fired by his wrestlers after just one match, providing humor to the audience. Throughout his career, Cornette managed various wrestlers and he eventually formed his first faction called the Cornette Dynasty, which included Carl Fergie, Norman Frederick Charles III, and the Angel Frank Morrell. In November 1983, Bill Watts and Jerry Jarrett initiated a talent exchange, leading to Cornette being paired with Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton to create the Midnight Express, a highly successful tag team. Cornette's famous tennis racket, which he carried as a manager, was inspired by the obnoxious rich kid in the movie Screwballs. Interestingly, when crowds were rowdy, Cornette would often load his racket with a horseshoe in case he was attacked by any angry fans. As a manager, Cornette was involved in numerous major feuds, often committing dastardly deeds like throwing a fireball into Ronnie Garvin's face. He suffered real injuries, blowing out his knees in a scaffold fall at Starrcade in 1986, which severely damaged his ligaments. In 1993, Cornette briefly managed the Heavenly Bodies for WCW whilst promoting his company Smoky Mountain Wrestling. Later, he formed a working relationship with the WWF where he worked until 2005. During his time in the WWF, Cornette gained fame inside the internet wrestling community for his work shoots, where he expressed his thoughts on both the positive and negative aspects of modern wrestling, a practice he still continues today with his famous podcast. Cornette's legacy in wrestling remains highly respected and vehemently opposed, depending on your individual perspectives. Regardless of opinions, his contributions to the wrestling world are undeniable. Number 2. Bobby the Brain Heenan. Famously known for his heel manager work and being one of the greatest commentators ever alongside Gorilla Monsoon, Bobby the Brain Heenan began his wrestling career in 1965 for the Indianapolis promotion World Wrestling Association, where he worked as both a wrestler and a manager. Heenan rose to prominence in the AWA, where he first adopted the moniker The Brain while he was managing the team of Nick Bockwinkel and Ray the Crippler Stevens. During his time, Heenan received the nickname The Weasel, which would stick with him throughout his career, thanks to a remark from Dick the Bruiser. In the AWA, Heenan formed the Heenan family, which initially included Bockwinkel, Bobby Duncombe Sr., and Blackjack Lanza. Heenan's antics created so much heat that in January 1975, during a match in Chicago, a fan fired a gun at him. Although Heenan escaped unharmed, 5 people ringside were injured in the incident. In the same year, Bockwinkel captured the AWA World Heavyweight Championship, and later in 1976, Lanza and Duncombe won the AWA World Heavyweight Tag Team Championships, making Heenan the first manager to represent a promotion's top champions simultaneously. In 1979, Heenan left the AWA due to a storyline suspension, and he joined Georgia Championship Wrestling, where he quickly discovered a young Hulk Hogan. He later recommended Hulk Hogan to the AWA's owner Vern Gagne, playing a significant role in Hogan's career. Brother! During the AWA's Japan tour in 1983, Heenan suffered a neck injury in a match with Atsushi Onita, which severely affected his in-ring abilities. He then made the jump to the WWF in 1984 and initially planned to manage Jesse the Body Ventura. However, Ventura's retirement led to a new partnership with Big John Studd. In the WWF, Heenan even reformed the Heenan family, managing almost every top heel in the promotion. Heenan famously feuded with Hulk Hogan for the first 3 WrestleManias. Heenan's most famous role came as the manager of Rick Rude, guiding him to an Intercontinental Championship victory over the Ultimate Warrior. He also wrestled in a series of weasel suit matches against the Ultimate Warrior, who defeated Heenan and forced him to don a weasel costume, much to the delight of us fans. Bobby the Brain Heenan later joined WCW as a beloved commentator, and his contributions to the wrestling industry continue to live in our hearts to this day. Number 1. Paul Heyman. Paul Heyman, often called the mad genius of professional wrestling, is most famous for his revolutionary promotion Extreme Championship Wrestling. His contributions as a manager and behind the scenes have been transformative to the wrestling industry. Heyman's journey in wrestling began in 1987 when, at the age of 14, he started as a photographer. He was fortunate enough to be mentored by the 3 wise men during his time at WWF events, learning the art of managing from them and traveling with them to and from shows. Heyman's passion for managing led him to production meetings at Jim Crockett's promotions, where he absorbed knowledge from the legendary figure Dusty Rhodes. With support of his friend Bam Bam Bigelow, Heyman made his manager's debut for Championship Wrestling from Florida under the moniker Paul E. Dangerously. By 1988, he found himself in the JCP, managing in a high-profile feud between the original Midnight Express and Jim Cornette's new Midnight Express. His skills extended to announcing as he joined Jim Ross, learning valuable lessons from JR that greatly influenced his career. In 1991, following a shake-up in WCW, Heyman reformed the Dangerous Alliance, this time featuring Rick Rude as the centerpiece alongside Steve Austin, Arn Anderson, Larry Zbyszko, Medusa, and Bobby Eaton. The faction dominated WCW as a top heel group, solidifying Heyman's reputation as an on-screen manager. After parting ways with WCW, Heyman embarked on one of his most significant endeavors, rebranding Eastern Championship Wrestling as Extreme Championship Wrestling. ECW's revolutionary style and attitude laid the groundwork for the future of wrestling, producing many future superstars who either started or passed through the promotion. Heyman later made his way to the WWE, becoming the lead writer of SmackDown in 2002. During this period, he began mentoring a young Brock Lesnar. leading to one of the most legendary pairings in wrestling history. In 2005, Heyman assumed the role of head booker and writer at Ohio Valley Wrestling, WWE's developmental territory, where he played an instrumental role in the growth of talents like CM Punk and Bobby Lashley. Though parting ways with the WWE in 2006, Heyman would return in 2012 at the request of Brock Lesnar. This collaboration led to some of Heyman's best works as legal counselor for Lesnar on screen. In recent times, Heyman is prominently featured in the WWF as the wise man in Roman Reigns' bloodline, showcasing his exceptional skills as a manager at the top level and continuing to solidify his legacy as the greatest manager in wrestling history.